¿Empezamos? Hola, hola. ¿Empezamos? Sí, perfecto. Bueno, hola. Hola. Bueno, muchas gracias.
Hello, thank you very much. You can't hear me. Is that better? Sorry, the microphone moves slightly. Let me hold it here.
¿Por aquí? Vale. Ya. Se me viene como encima. Lo malo de ser bajita.
It's too bad I'm short. Okay. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. I want to thank the organizers for the invitation. I'm Mariana Bilnitsky from the Alternativas Económicas magazine, and I'll be the facilitator of this session. We are here to discuss two basic notions: time poverty and inequality from time uses and the right to time. We will discuss all of these, but first we will hear from three panelists actually. We have pre-recorded videos from them, and they will tell us about these notions of time use and inequality. Firstly, we will hear from Emel Memis. Emel is an associate professor at the Ankara University. Welcome. And he will explain to us this notion of time use and its implications, its impact on inequality. Ahli Koban. Ahli is a specialist of the UNDP in Turkey, and he will discuss a survey that has been conducted implementing this same notion in Turkey during the pandemic. And then we will hear from Lina Galvez. Yes, there she is, Lina Galvez, who is an MPE by the Socialist Party, and she is an expert on gender. And she will tell us about women's poverty in Europe and the report that has been issued by the European Parliament. Okay, so we can start with Emil, and you have 10 minutes, sir.
Thank you. Hello, Ankara. these moments of time. Time is capital. Well, actually, I'm a little bit about time poverty and this post truth, but if we sustainable development goal, the first one told me about ending extreme poverty for all people everywhere. No dictating for human rights. We know that everyone has the right to everyone has the right to vote with their and human rights documents, the multi-dimensional complicated matter, which is defined as enjoy the right to society and to people as well. Insights have been influential poverty research from on the lack of private income or consumption, social support services, and we know that those types of poverty so most basic human on poverty issues ever since the and especially focusing on women poverty, organization of poverty, the declaration of poverty measures to understand. So one thing for is to extract all these measures, the gender demand poverty. We know that poverty considering the division of public. And this is considered even in the concept of child labor. All these reports can be reviewed by using special resource. Time is a fundamental ethical issue in any society. He says that if all or most of human life is consumed by routine daily work, then humanity is dominated by the socially determined way of experiencing time. So the knowledge of time shows us how we experience all the inequalities or poverty issues. So to improve human life socially or economically, it is a needed and necessary information. So all these debates and affected the measurement of poverty as well, and considered time use as a necessary input, time use data and information as a necessary input in poverty measurement. We know that there have been a great effort actually by international institutions, by academicians and policymakers working on ending poverty through policies and through measurements. The recent efforts have been focusing on linking time use information with income or consumption measurement of poverty, not just taking them separately, but linking them to understand interlinkages in between. So, not like the conventional measures, poverty is not just a monetary issue. It is not just, it cannot be measured by just the threshold, which establishes a line separating the poor from the non-poor. But what we need to get rid of the assumption that all the resources are divided, distributed equally among the household members. So that assumption, by implication, tells us that each household member has the same poverty status. But as feminists, we know that that assumption of equally shared either income or poverty in a household is a problematic one. So the unitary household approach has been criticized by many feminist scholars. And what we did is we tried to understand gender dimensions of poverty by linking it with time use inequalities. And one of the recent attempts on measurement has been provided with my colleagues, together with my colleagues at the Levy Economics Institute. It's a measure of time and income poverty, which provides a multi-country evidence actually on the interlinkages between time and income measurement for well-being. And what it looks at is it assesses the poverty thresholds not only on the basis of access to monetary resources, but also access to adequate time, which enables the consumption of household produced goods and services, also including care for children, for elderly, and for perhaps the adults who do not care, who do not need care activities by a third person. So what we do is we provide a measure, a comprehensive measure that take into account the time deficits of individuals within the household. And here you can see that with the extended measure of income and time poverty, we realize that it has a gender picture again. It has a gender estimates, the results, compared to the conventional measure who are not poor. We can find the hidden poor who are timely poor in terms of time deficits. They become poor if you do consider time use inequalities. And this is a result, as we know, women suffer from higher poverty rates almost all over the world, and due to low wage rates, or particularly for long working hours. And these are the main underlying causes. But it's not just the work in the market, it's also long hours of work within the household or within the communities that we can take into account in our measurement. And this shows us multi-country results compared to women and men who are not conventionally poor, but time and income poor, comparing with the two-dimensional estimations. And here what we see is women are disproportionately affected by the employment hours as well. When we talk about social policies to end poverty, we usually talk about providing opportunities, job opportunities for everyone who cannot access to their rights to work. But what we see here, some of the policies that we implement can result in time poverty if you do not consider the two-dimensional side of poverty, considering all non-monetary resources we have. As long as the number of hours, working hours increases, women, especially working in both in rural and urban areas, becomes almost all of them become time poor if we consider these two-dimensional measurement. And finally, one other point that I would like to mention, it is related to the specific specific moment that we have been going through with COVID-19. We have been analyzing the time use data that Aslı is going to mention more about. We could be able to collect during the lockdown. It was like a social experiment, actually, that we could manage. Unfortunately, due to pandemic situation, we could understand what happens when the adults of the household members go back to home or reduce their working hours or start working hybrid conditions. What happens to the gender gaps in time use allocations? And we could be able to repeat that after the, in a sense, pseudo-normal post-COVID era as well. And at the end, what we tried to understand was we tried to see how the division of labor changes if in a crisis like in a health crisis, but it has a lot of economic impacts, which led to employment disruptions, job losses, again disproportionately faced by women in many countries. We wanted to see how enduring the impact of the pandemic on gender gaps, focusing on the Turkish data, how the changes in employment status affect, and we also could do simulation exercises. If we have shorter working weeks, short working hours, what would happen to the division of labor, and how egalitarian could we division of labor we could reach, and how the gender inequalities were persistent after the pandemic situation. And we could be able to find out that women actually during the pandemic, although there has been a kind of decrease in total working hours after the normalization, now compared to the pre-pandemic situation, has been spending longer hours of work compared to men. So it has been showing us that unless there are complementary policies, unless there are policies that also go beyond the market limits, economic and macroeconomic policies that considers all these dynamics and changes in the time use patterns, we will not be able to reach the egalitarian or right to time on equal foot. Thank you so much. I'll just stop here and continue if you have any questions or comments at the end of the panel. Thanks a lot again.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Emil. And now we'll go to the next speaker, to Aslı Joban.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you for inviting me to this big event this year's Time Use Week. I'm really glad to be here with you, and I wish I could be there in person, but the conditions, you know. Well, I'm Aslı Çoban. I'm a sociologist and working as the gender equality analyst of the UNDP country office. I have to say in advance that I'm so sorry that I'm gonna read my presentation to be able to finish on time. And I will speak very briefly about the pandemic period time use survey, which was conducted with UNDP support in Turkey in May 2020. As an example of innovative non-governmental alliance rapidly and timely formed to generate data on the emerging time use trends at the advent of the pandemic. And afterwards, I will shortly turn to what the analysis of the data from the research revealed. First, a little background. We must say that even before the pandemic period and as a structural and chronic feature, Turkey was one of the countries with the biggest gender gaps in unpaid domestic labor burden in families, women working for 4.7 hours and men for 1.7 hours a day on average. This pattern is the consequence of the patriarchal structures and the care regime preferences demanding first, care needs to be met in families rather than through non-family service provision, and second, caregiving to be performed in the families by women as housewives rather than based on a principle of equal sharing between genders. As a result of that policy preference in Turkey, women have come to have a very limited labor market participation and employment rates, and often precarious positions in the labor markets and career life. In response, we, as a development society, have always been looking for ways to reduce women's unpaid domestic labor burden, being aware that this was essential for achievement of the target of gender equality. Coming to the pandemic, well, despite the very popular motto used to describe the pandemic-created world, the life has stopped. Often used together with the scenes from the deserted streets and workplaces, we were aware that the life has moved actually into homes, creating a big demand for household labor of various kinds. So we were vigilant towards any emerging trend of change in the amount and distribution of unpaid labor performed in the domestic realm. This is why we as UNDP were basically looking for ways to conduct studies to capture the situation and the trends, and also learn and accordingly put our ways of thinking on crisis resilient and gender responsive care economy to the test of the unique conditions posed by the pandemic containment measures. At this stage, the long-standing dialogue of the UNDP Istanbul Regional Public Gender Team and the UNDP Country Office with a prominent feminist researchers network delivered its reward. Two prominent feminist economists, and one of them is among us, and I, teaming up with a strong research company, which was regularly conducting living conditions surveys in Turkey, have been able to integrate time use questions to one of the company's surveys and analyze the data in a policy note for the UNDP Turkey country office. This was indeed a very innovative alliance which made this type of a timeless study possible. And I'm very glad to say that the collaboration between the research company and the Society of Feminist Scholars have continued afterwards. Well, Emel is with us today, and she's much better positioned than me to elaborate on the design and findings of the survey, actually. Nonetheless, I will try to summarize the main takeaways in broad lines and from the perspective and position of UNDP. For those findings still underpin our perspectives and approaches to the issue of programming for a gender equal and crisis resilient society. In survey data, we basically saw that women's labor burden has enormously risen, while a certain group of men have also increased their shares in the domestic workload, as they felt the need for that, but more importantly, they were able to work from home. So some of the UNDP's important arguments have found a new evidence base, and they are first, the pressure on the unpaid labor of women can quickly climb, reach an unbearable level during a crisis like the COVID-19 pandemic, and threaten the gender equality achievements of the past and the well-being of society as a whole. And second, workplace flexibility policies could be important instruments to encourage equal sharing of the household responsibilities between women and men when used correctly. And lastly, investments on care services and work-life balance policies are essential ways of recovering from and increasing the resilience of families and society in the face of a similar crisis. And we are still at UNDP building on the insights of these findings. And I will stop.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Just to say we are out of time. Yeah.
Yeah. I was just saying that.
I'm sorry.
Thank you very much for bearing with me. And I was going to say, I hope I didn't exceed my time limits, but apparently I did. Sorry. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Muchas gracias. Siento que, bueno, hemos empezado un poco tarde y vamos un poquito tarde con...
Yes, it's a bit. We're running a bit late for the presentations. We have a presentation of Lina Galbeth, and then we'll have a panel, a round table. So, Lina, I'll ask you to manage time in this respect. Thank you. Thank you ever so much.
Me here as a member of European Parliament because I was a rapporteur of this report on the poverty of women within the European Union. You asked me to shift to Spanish, so I will shift to Spanish in order to go faster, but I feel I will be here with two caps as a feminist economist and also as a time use scholar. So that made me to include time poverty for the first time in a report within the European Parliament. So I'll try to do my best. So, hola.
Hello. I'm switching to Spanish as I've been requested. First of all, I'll tell you about why this report in the European Parliament. Secondly, why this gender gap in poverty is less obvious than in other areas such as income, employment, and so on. What should we do? That'd be the second area. What should we do to end this female poverty? That's another consideration. The risk of poverty in the EU is different for women than for men. It's 22.7 higher for women than for men. It is a gap which is less obvious than we can see in other fields. And this is due to the way we process information, and also because we conceive poverty in a narrow manner in terms of time use poverty as has been described. In this sense, we are not seeing the structural character of this poverty, which this sort of vicious circle, if you like, and the implications of this perpetuation of poverty between generations. Especially when we're talking of child poverty, we must bear in mind that most of the homes where there is poverty are, if you like, households where there's a single motherhood. And we must bear in mind that the deprivation of certain capacities in childhood will be very difficult to catch up, if you like, in the later circles of life. So, why do we say that this gap is difficult to, if you like, deal with? Well, because we take unit of analysis, and normally the first unit of analysis is the family. And members of the family have access, supposedly, to common resources, which is true to a certain extent only. But those who have control of the resources, and in that sense, it was explained by a philosopher, the family unit is a unit of cooperative conflict, and throughout history, access to resources that women have had is very different and much lower systematic than the men. So we cannot see the family as a sort of a smooth unit where there's no conflict. That is absolutely not true, because inequalities do generate conflict. So, secondly, there is a multi-dimensional nature of poverty. It is true that we have moved forward with this multi-dimensionality. We're talking of severe issues, but we must know what is the real rate of women's poverty amongst women if we wish to actually find sound solutions in terms of time use, because we are not considering all the unpaid work that in most countries women carry out. It is often superior to remunerated work in the case of women, and that happens in most countries and in most homes. So women are exhausted, if you like, in terms of their multiple roles. And often women do not have time or energy to improve their, if you like, their training or their educational, if you like, itinerary. And this does lead to a vicious circle in that sense, a downward spiral. And let me conclude. We define time poverty as a lack of available time after discounting work time, remunerated or not, in terms of time available for their personal development and enjoyment. Right. Third point, and I am going fairly fast as you have asked me to. The third question is, how do we face up to solutions to reverse that. There are two different planes. Firstly, how can we seize the situation better to find out what the true situation is, and therefore find public policies which will be able to put an end to the poverty and this gender gap in terms of poverty as well, particularly among women, of course. We need better statistics, more reliable statistics. I have participated in the field of statistics. I have worked in statistics, but I shall tell you that the statistics do need to have a gender approach embedded into them. We know that the fields and the if you like, the random selection criteria, the selection criteria should have a gender bias, if you like, or gender perspective. And also we must take account of ages, because age groups are too wide. We lose everything that has to do with older citizens, the older sections of the population. And there are important pockets of poverty amongst older single mothers. And we do need that in all countries. We should carry out periodical studies, and that is not being done at the moment. These studies are not being carried out, these systematic studies over time. And when it comes to public policies, there are two different levels. On the one hand, there is one level which is more central, if you like. We need a different economic policy. We need different kind of governance, an economic governance which does not systematically lead to inequalities. We are reacting after COVID. There have been significant changes in economic governance within the EU. But not just in the EU, but in the whole world, we had been dealing with the consequences and the knock-on effects of an economic crisis, which has generated a lot of wealth, but very badly shared out. There are levels of poverty which are shameful in many parts of the world. So we must generate economic policies which will ensure a more equitable share out of benefits and proceeds, and a redistribution via fiscal and tax policy in a welfare state, which leaves no one behind. We do need specific policies to combat poverty. We are going to work within Parliament with minimum income policies. These are essential for low-income citizens, and we also need to increase the minimum wage aspects, and women have a low, if you like, take-up in the labour market because there's also this unseen, unpaid work. But with basic minimum income will take into account of low wages, but what is not being borne in mind is inequality in the share out of non-remunerated work in the home. And that should be taken on board. One last thought on the current situation.
Informe que se ha hecho sobre la COVID. Aquí,
if we look at the reports which are being issued by the European Parliament to see the knock-on effect of COVID, I am a part of some of these committees, and take into due account the feminist perspective, we are aware that we have been hit by another crisis, which brings high levels of inflation, and the costs of inflation. Who is going to bear them? It shouldn't just be the workers. The companies should also take their part of the burden. And right now, it is important to react in an appropriate manner and never forget the importance of non-remunerated work in the policies that will deal with inequality, and also that bearing all that has on the genuine opportunities, not just fictitious opportunities, the genuine, real opportunities. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry I have overshot my time. Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias a las panelistas.
Well, now I'd like to ask the panelists. Well, let's say, to summarize, I think all those of us who are here coincide with this, the idea of the panelists, that it is a gender situation, a question of gender, and we women are the ones who are the ones who suffer most. We have less time for everything. There is more work which is both remunerated and non-remunerated. Precariousness is rampant amongst women, even amongst children, that has been mentioned. And how do we actually measure poverty? And we also look at the difficulty of metrics in that sense, and the lack of, if you like, reliable data. I don't know if there are any questions. If not, if there are no questions, we move straight into the panel. We really are running behind time. Okay. I'll ask the following people to come up to the table. Sara Moreno, and yes, Ulrich Mülkenberger, Sara Moreno, and Ivo Golombek. Someone will be joining us remotely. Hello. Here we have Diego Colombek. He is a director of time and experience in the interdisciplinary time University of San Andres in Argentina. Sara Moreno is a lecturer in the Autonomous University in Barcelona and collaborates in the research in everyday life and work. And we have Yaya Herrero, who is a specialist in knowledge and eco-social projects and is an advisor to UNESCO on environmental education and other aspects. Let us start off. Oh, and I am missing someone who is, yes, Ulrich Mülkenberger, there on the screen, who works in the University of Hamburg and is president of the German Association of Time Use. Let us start off with the gentleman who's online.
No.
Is it my turn now?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you very much, everybody. I'm really sorry that I cannot be in Barcelona at the Time Use Week, but I have a commitment in Milano for which I shall which I have to take aware of. And my presentation is it now the do you see it? Okay. Unfortunately I don't see it in the front of the. No. Oh yes. No. When we speak about the right to time, you know that I was an expert who was of the Council of Europe, and we succeeded in 2010 for the first time to have the right to time in a European document. It's a Council of Europe. It's not the European Union. But it was important, I think. But as a lawyer and political scientist, I am in a position that I would like to know more about how does a right emerge. Because it's easy to speak about the right to time, or like the right to work, or the right of children, and so on. But to enforce or to let such a right emerge is a long process, which I'm now 77 years old, so that means I experienced a lot of emergences of rights. First, there is a social need, a social hope, which gains ground. Then, a prerequisite of a right is that the need and the hope collectivizes, that it gets a collective support, that there are experiments, efforts to generalize it over groups and over regions. Then the next step is within which we are here in the Barcelona Time Use Week, that a regulative idea emerges, like the right to vote in the history, collective expression, or equal rights for women, right to work, children's rights, right for the nature, which are, some of these rights are already acknowledged, others are still underway of developing. Then starts a struggle about the disputed or alleged right. And among these debates, a relatively strong role plays the proof of the existence of examples of these rights. And I give some in my short talk. And then, of course, a strategy to develop this right in analogy to already existing examples of the right. This could also be the case in the case of the right to time. You know that we understand under the right to time 5 pillars or 5 elements, the most important of which is self-determination over one's own time. That means that you are not stolen your time, like in the trains or in the waiting rooms of doctors, that you are not stolen time, that you are able to self-determinate how to organize your time. This involves the second point, non-discrimination regarding to the use of time. And we spoke here already when speaking about poverty, we spoke about the gendered character of time poverty, and the gendered character involves, for a legal scholar like myself, involves discrimination, which is against the right to time. A bit more complicated part of the right to time is no social devaluation of times. We all know that there are groups of people in society who have enough time, but who have times which are socially devaluated. Unemployed people, elderly people often have time, but the social organization of time underdevelops or underdevaluates these times, which is against the right to time. The fourth element of the right to time is that all people have to have time culture, a right to time culture, that they are allowed to develop an own estimation of their times and what is valuable for them for times, and should have a stake within the social organization of time. And the fifth point, which I just tried to remember, I developed that earlier in many articles and books, is the right to collectively shared times. We know that in our times, in industry or in services, in the working life, we often have time puzzles where each individual has to organize his or her everyday life around certain needs, and where the collective, where the family, the community, the neighborhood, it does not have any more a chance to develop social cohesion and so on. So when we look at these five pillars, this is the normative aspect only. That means that is what we have as a regulatory idea in mind. If we look at the practical legal organization, we find small but interesting examples where the right to time has already been acknowledged, though often without the term right to life. For example, the European Court of Justice developed a concept that flight delays, which is a stolen time in my earlier notion, that flight delays have to be compensated by the airlines. A second element, in many member states of the European Union, we have now the right to see a specialized doctor within a 3 weeks delay, not in next February or early or later next year, but to have a 3 weeks clause within which a specialized doctor has to be available, accessible for patients. The European Court of Human Rights accepted remedies against delayed court procedures. That means if you claim against someone else and the court over years does not hear your case, or if you are under criminal accusation, if the court does not care for your case, this may cause, this is a right to time, obviously, this may cause compensation. Right for parents for kindergarten places and hours, this is what you all know. But right to disconnect, the new initiative of the European Parliament, is also a right to time. For example, if you see it as a remedy, as an effort of a remedy against the delimitation of gainful work at the cost of your private or your family life. Or take as a last example, which I have here, the German ministers, gender ministers or women's ministers, just took a decision in favor of our model of optional times in the working career, during the working career, of drawing rights for care and further education for up to a minimum of 9 years in working life, which is quite a lot of another organization of the adult life of men and women. So we have some elements of the right to time already existing, and I could explain them. I sketched it very in a small, on a small level. What we need is really to develop, and this is why I totally appreciate this concept of time poverty, like Goodin developed it in my sense in a very productive way. We need, in order to achieve a right to time, we have to operationalize more concretely the concept of time poverty, like in the case of social assistance, where the concept of money poverty was very, very much concretized with the concept of the shopping basket, so that finally it was accepted by the courts, that was during the 1960s or so, that it was accepted by the courts that this social assistance had to be a right and not just a discretionary measure of the administrations. And the same has to take place in the case of time poverty, to be accepted as a basic human dignity minimum, and then to be acknowledged as a general right, which is now just splintered and in smaller contents. Okay, that was my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Ulrich. Let us now... I don't know whether there are any questions, by the way, from the floor. Anyway, let's move to the panel, and Ulrich, of course, you can participate online. Let us look at the presentation. Diego Golombek is going to talk to us how time and inequalities have a bearing on health. And then we'll hear from Yaya Herrero, who shall talk about how time, poverty, and inequalities also have an impact on the planet and sustainability in cities. And then, last but not least, Sala Moreno, who will talk to us about inequalities and poverty and how they have a knock-on effect on the gender perspective and gender issues. So anyway, it's all yours. Primero, good morning. Thank you very much for having invited me. It's a pleasure to be here, the TUW and Diplocat, the invitation. And I have to talk as a researcher, as a neuroscientist, as a biologist, of the effect on of matters of time on health. Let's go back a bit in time. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR, is the most poetic and beautiful document which we have developed as a species. But rights are often biased and twisted. They allow to aggregate new ones, they can be reviewed, and that is what's been done, like in the 1948 Declaration of the UDHR. Rights in terms of gender perspective was not included, or rights related to precarious in the place of work, or robotics, or whatever, and the right of time was not enshrined. And they are like secondary rights or sub-rights, and not only do we have a right to time, we have a right to time to do what? And of course, there's we have a right to sleep, to decent, healthy sleep, and that doesn't seem right. And often people that the sound people get up really early and sleep little because, like, seen as almost as a waste of time, because that is not what we're taught to do. But the big thief of time is Thomas Edison, who textually said that he invented electric light to combat the tyranny of time. And a more recent follower of Edison, the Netflix CEO, told his main competitor is not other platforms, but sleep. And we have to combat sleep. If we want to have the right to sleep, we should understand it and what it's all about. And the number of questions which we have to tackle. The first is, why do we sleep? Why do we have to sleep? If we have to defend sleep, well, why do we sleep? When do we sleep? What are the times? How much do we sleep and how we sleep? And science, and I am a neuroscientist, has answers. And it's very simple, a very simple question in 2 words. All the questions have to do with time and sleep. Well, haven't a clue. Something that's obvious, we don't know it. Maybe that is why we are lagging behind in terms of learning how sleep should be a right, and how there's such a thing as sleep deprivation or poverty. Sleep poverty. If we look in a lab and deprive animals of sleep, will die. If you keep a rat or a mouse and you don't feed it, it'll die. If you don't allow it to sleep, it'll also die. Well, let me tell you what happens to somebody who doesn't sleep for 11.5 days. What happens? Well, how long will they sleep? 14 hours. They won't sleep for a week if they're deprived of sleep for a week. So there's also a right to sleep recovery. How often do we sleep? The answer is very simple. Not enough, not much. The recommendations, scientific recommendations from North America and South America is at least 7 hours sleep per night. We're way lag behind. Not much, but a term of 15, 20 minutes less than that is a lot. In fact, there are data that say we are asleep at least 1 hour less than a number of years ago. And if we look at 7 or 8 hours, we knock off a couple of hours, that's a lot. And if we get an extrapolation in terms of time, and we continue this trend, I can say that around 2070, we won't sleep anymore. But that is where we're going, if you like. We're heading in that direction. Why this defense of the how, why, when, and how much? Because it does have a bearing on health, and lack of equality in terms of time will have a bearing on it. The first thing is that we are sleepy during the day. If we don't sleep well, we'll be drowsy during the day, and that's not good. Nothing we should be proud of. There's a change in our state of mind. If you sleep badly, will have a direct, if you like, bearing on our social and human relationships. We'll be grumpy, drowsy, and irritable. But sleep deficiency, sleep deprivation will have a direct negative bearing on our health. For instance, it'll affect cognitive powers. I won't be able to learn properly or memorize. If you have an exam the following day, the worst thing you can do is to study all night long. What you have to do is study one thing, sleep, and memorize that. Right? You cannot remember everything. And we also know that the lack of sleep has a big bearing on metabolism. For instance, if you sleep badly or sleep is a factor which will lead to obesity and overweight. Or not only just to sleep badly, but sleep with a light on, or your TV, if you like, switched on. And that will apparently lead to overweight. And so it's not a question of eating too much, but sleeping with a light on. And technology is not an ally of these rights, in particular technology which has to do with screens. We don't sleep alone, we sleep with a screen on, a TV or telephone or tablet or whatever. And the LEDs, diodes, emit a light at a wavelength which directly stimulates your biological clock, which leads us to sleep less or sleep badly or not sleep at all. There'll be a campaign not just to the right to sleep, but the right to disconnect, eliminate the screens. When we talk of inequalities, and I'll conclude, we talk of inequalities, we say, well, how can we deal with the disequalities which have to do with sleep? Well, there's a lot of research involved, which is expensive and lengthy. And let me just give one extraordinary example from a group of the Nobel Peace Prize in Economics, who said that we can carry out massive tests with control groups, which were carried out in India by Amartya Sen. And it was a 5-year-long experiment, and you needed a special, if you like, a plan for that. And people in extreme poverty, they were offered a job, an employment, which could be quantified, and they were and we looked at different sleep conditions. The control one, which was bad because if people sleep, we have worked in Argentina with inequality in terms of access to comfortable conditions where sleep take place, and then different offers to sleep better mattresses, give them a ventilator, switch light off to cut, or if like pull down the blinds, and what impact this had on their leaving poverty and their possibility of, if you like, going up the ladder in the capitalist system. And the siesta was very important, a nap, giving an opportunity to nap to earn more and have more possibility of moving out of poverty. And so we saw how disequality of sleep patterns does have a direct bearing on their if like their welfare. And does sleep have something to do with which happens all night long when we sleep? I say every night is not quite true. We have a right to dreams. We all have dreams and have a right to attempt to fulfill them. But to fulfill your dreams, you have to have dreams. And to dream, we have to sleep. And so, and of course, to be able to fulfill your dreams, you need to sleep, therefore. And all this time use week, we all of us have different definition of social sciences, of biorhythms, but the only way to define it properly is St. Augustine. St. Augustine, he said, if I am asked, I cannot define it, but if you don't ask it, well, everybody knows what we're talking about. We cannot define it, but we should define its use, and that sleep and dreams reach the whole population.
Buenos días a todas y a todos. También quiero agradecer la posibilidad de estar aquí.
We apologize. Now it works. I'm very happy to be here and sharing this panel with my fellow panelists. I've been asked to focus on the connection between time, poverty, and sustainability, and I will share a series of reflections with you that can be food for thought, and we can discuss it later. I'd like to focus, to start with, on this notion of sustainability. Well, my notion of sustainability, because again, this notion can be defined differently. I'll talk about the sustainability of life. And let me say that human life is underpinned by key relationships. For example, our connection and relationship with nature, everything that we use as human beings to underpin and support our human life. I'm talking about energy, water, air, etc. And then the interdependency relations among people. An isolated human being will not survive in specific human life cycle phases like childhood, the old age, or in ill health. Well, to live physically, you need to be connected to other people. So life sustainability is the process that is implemented in connection with nature and other people so that life can move on and be sustained. But what's the problem that we face? Well, we have organized ways of living together, especially in capitalist societies, that basically bump into the timings of sustained life, especially nature. And I will focus on that. What we call the environmental social crisis today could be defined as clashes, as head-on clashes between what is needed for slower cycles that take place in natural systems and breakneck speed cycles that take place in hegemonic economic models. We could talk about, or we could say that climate change is nothing but a huge speeding up of GHG emissions compared to the GHG processes that generated coal, oil underground. It took it 300 million years, and in the last 80 years, these oil, natural gas, and coal have all been burned at breakneck speed. We could say that currently the energy crisis has to do with the use of minerals and energy that are not renewable at an insane speed. We could say that the loss of biodiversity has to do with a highly accelerated change in the biogeochemical features and beings that do not have time to adapt to the new conditions. So if we check the unsustainability problem of human life and other species, we see the clashes, not only territorial clashes, but also time clashes. And that clash is experienced with brutal inequality. And that has to do with the hierarchies that throughout history, and especially the history of the West, we live in a world in which human life is worth much more than any other living being's life. So white people's life are worth much more than any other life. Men's lives are worth more than women's life, which means that the consequences of this provisional or this time crisis replicate the cross-cutting inequality framework, and this time and sustainability crisis impacts disproportionately that those people that are not white, businessmen, autonomous, etc., and let alone other species, as the feminists say. So This inequality has several dimensions to it, and I'll be focusing on cities because cities today are the biggest space of unsustainability. They are energy use intensive. They are extremely fragile because in most cities nothing is manufactured to sustain life. Everything has to be imported into the city, and natural and waste has to be exported from the city very rapidly. And they are places where these problem of unsustainability of life and these clash with planetary dynamics generate dimensional problems. As Lena said, we have energy poverty, and we encounter these very often in our cities. In these times of energy crisis, there are people who cannot turn on the heating, and they have to self-regulate in their energy consumption because they cannot afford it. Then we see an increase of fast food, lower quality food, and a scarcity of the food that comply with the time cycles and do not poison the planet in their crops. And then transportation, it's quite an issue. We live in societies that have grown dramatically, and we need to invest a lot of energy and time to take care of the different dimensions of lives. You have to go and take care of your parent, or commute to your workplace, go to the place where supply takes place. So cities have been built thinking about only about the commuting, home, workplace, and not the rest of dimensions that are needed to sustain life. That inequality is currently reflected in the frequency and speed with which we have cold waves and heat waves. There are huge challenges ahead to adapt in cities. Also, difficulties in terms of water consumption patterns and paces. This is a problem, especially in areas affected by climate change with droughts, and that generates huge inequality. Ill health, I really loved what you said, Diego. I think it's very relevant, but also in terms of air quality. The speed at which air is deteriorated in cities also makes people fall sick, and that has a high incidence. And as Lena said, this is a matter of age. I mean, our younger people and the elderly are much more affected. We could talk about the inequality in the mental health sphere. We are talking about eco-anxiety, and I wonder if this is a problem, a mental health problem, or it's a very healthy way of approaching the problems of our time. And I think that there's a huge relational poverty, rushing around from one place to another, and the way we build the city has resulted in awful individuation of people, and that results in community disorders and disruptions in moments in which community organization and having stronger districts from a relational standpoint, well, would enable us to better face these material, energy and climate crises. So to wrap up, I believe that sustainability and time are directly connected. Times for life should be a cycle, and slower times. We need to change the way we understand time. We should move away from the times of the economy and how our time has been organized by the economy. And as the environmental and feminist economy have pointed out at some times, if we check the iceberg of the capitalist economy, at the top we see the visible part, which has an impact on the balances of the systems ecosystems, and everything from resources to minerals to rivers to forests and then people's time, everything is consumed and digested at breakneck speed. And underneath, there is a much bigger part that is underpinning the top part, and it uses many Earth's assets and goods at a pace that is incompatible with life. And there's the seizure of many work hours conducted by women in most places, allowing for those bodies, those lives to be sustained on a daily basis. So a precondition for the existence of life is precisely the existence of these aspects, of these spheres that are usually hidden, and they have different paces, a pace that clashes dramatically with the market pace. So we need to solve unsustainability issues from a justice perspective. Thank you very much.
Bien, pues muchísimas
Okay, thank you very much. Apologies, but the microphone is off. Thank you very much. I have been asked. I don't think they can hear you. Not really. Very low. The microphone is very, very low. Good afternoon. No, it's not the right microphone that is on. I'd like to share some reflections about the gender perspective and time poverty.
sentido voy a intentar añadir algunas ideas para no solamente.
I'd like to add a few ideas. I think there's a point of departure, which is very interesting. You think that when we talk of time poverty and talk inequalities, what we're talking is that when there's a lack of opportunity to access a resource, which in this case is time. Inequalities emerge when we are in different situations when it comes to accessing basic resources. And we're talking of time as a resource. But time as a resource has very specific features because we're starting from a paradox. All of us share the same amount of time a day, 24 hours, which make up our day. There's a point of resource which puts us on equal footing, but what generates inequality? The quality of the resource, not the quantity. And when in terms of quality, we must think of content. What do we do with our time allotted, and not just how many hours, but the meaning we give to time. That is an important element. And furthermore, another element which generates disequality has to do with the capacity to manage this time and to distribute this time with a certain autonomy, with a capacity to decide how you manage and distribute this throughout the day without it if you like, depending on different situations. So we can see how time poverty emerges and social inequalities linked to the use of time, which have a clear gender bias. Because when we calculate how much time people have for their, which are available to them personally, their private time, and what they do with it, if we look in Spain, and if you look at the latest data from time use, which go back some time and perhaps they're no longer valid, and I will also share with Lina, we do need reliable data and accurate data. But when we calculate time used in Spain, we see that there's a percentage of the population with time poverty. But when we incorporate the gender perspective, we see how it goes up to 24%. And when on top of that, on top of the gender perspective, we see how many women have time poverty. We nuance a bit more. We see that women who have young children, it goes up to 35%. So we're incorporating certain variables in gender which will allow us to fine-tune and see which are the sections of the population which have a greater risk of time use poverty. And from a gender perspective, I'd like to look at at one thing. Time is multidimensional. My interest is to link time to work, and there we begin to find answers. Why do women have greater time poverty? Because they work more. The sexual division of labor. And if we look at time, the data bear that out. Total work burden, when we add up remunerated work with time dedicated to non-remunerated work, care and homework and housework, well, women work a lot more than men. And not all women do in the same aspect. We have to include other variables. Ethnicity, if you like, social class, life cycle, and on the whole, women work more. They work more hours a day, more hours a week than men. But what lies behind that burden of work, which is excessive, is women spend more time in non-remunerated work, care and housework than men. That's important because remunerated work has social recognition, and housework and care work outside remunerated work framework doesn't, and puts us in a situation of less autonomy, less decision-making power. When a person is available taking on board invisible and non-remunerated work, they have less time available for the public space, less time for public participation, for political participation, for social relationships, less time to sleep and to dream. And that is where we find the hard kernel of this time poverty which affects women more. Has it always been the case? No. When we analyze with historical perspective and linear data, what we see is that if we look at the last 40 years, if we look at a world level and a European level, we see that there is a trend to gender convergence. In the last 40 years, women spend a bit less time to housework, and men spend a bit more time on housework. So that does begin to diminish this gender gap in terms of time use. But if we fine-tune a bit more and delve deeper, what we see is that has happened because it's because women, with a massive entry into the labor market, spend more time in remunerated work. But men do not do housework with the same intensity. So women do a bit less housework, but care work, especially the children, stays the same. And men are beginning to care for kids, but not to the same intensity. When do men look after the kids, after the children? Well, Saturday mornings. Well, the women stay at home and cleaning the house. So men do housework and care in the more pleasant moments, not when they have to bathe the kids or feed them and serve them their dinner. And that also leaves to less time to manage time. That cuts back time, if you like, autonomy. And then let me lead you to another idea. It's not so much as what I do with my time, it's the meaning I attach to it. There's a debate in publications as to whether this gender convergence, which I have mentioned, is gradually increasing, or is at least maintained in terms of equality of opportunities and the capacity to manage time, if this is maintained or if there is a situation that is stagnating. We talked about the tension between have women changed more than men, and we have moved forward because women have changed. But when change affects men, there's a certain stagnation, or is there an increasing convergence? That is a question. The jury is still out, and there is a convergence. Yes, true, but it's very, very slow, and it is not happening across the board in a similar manner. There is certain inequality in terms of convergence, and we know that the population, which has less purchasing power, in if you like, city areas rather than rural areas, and who have less, if you like, care burdens, well, there will be an increase, not in other situations. I was saying it is as important how we distribute time and as the meaning we attach. And in this discussion, if we're in a situation of gender convergence which is slow, but which is slowly moving forward, or if we're stagnating in that gender convergence, because women have changed as much as they can, and when it comes to, and men don't change as the same pace, and then the gender poverty in terms of time will be maintained. If you look at relative resources, that explains things up to a point. And the point comes when individual perspectives do not explain to us what is happening and why it is so difficult to achieve this genuine time-use convergence and equality of opportunities. And the key question, or the billion-dollar question, is the significance which is given to tasks which are carried out, and what is visible and what is not visible. And what we can see is that even though there's been a drop in gender inequality in that sense, and even though yet they do persist, I should say. But what makes most difficult that this genuine equality in time use comes is the so-called mental burden. We have 24 hours a day. We can diminish the time we spend to non-remunerated work because there's co-responsibility with our partner and so on, within the family or whatever. But the mental burden, having to think how to organize, what to do, when to do, how to share out this, which does exist per se and is not seen, does generate time poverty. And that is very difficult to account for in statistics. And that is the big stumbling block which stops us from moving forward in an equal use of time. Dreaming, sleeping, and if you like to unload your mental burden is key to be able to relax and be able to recover. And that is essential to take full advantage of all these hours which are part of our daily, if you like, daily lives. I'll leave it there. Thank you. Thanks ever so much. We have some time for a slight discussion or to ask questions, and then we shall have a bit more time for questions from the audience. I don't know if you wish to send them up or whatever. I have a whole bunch of questions here. We have a little while for conversation here. I have a question for you. The last thing you said, the main obstacle is the mental burden. You said that. That surprised me because, well, public policies are not going to change the mental burdens, as you mentioned. There must be other strategies to do it. A public policy will allow you to ensure that there's greater, if you like, greater spaces for care, but the mindset is going to be difficult to change, right? And then public policy will not be able to deal with that. Well, I disagree. I do think that public policies can, if you like, deal with a change in mindset and diminish the mental burden. For me, what is key is where does a mental burden emerge? Within the population, there are people who accumulate a mental burden, others don't. And there can be different socializing patterns per gender. This does generate having, if you like, your housework in your head, in your mind, and others have to include that and also their lives. How does that materialize? It's a moral obligation for care. You feel utterly responsible for the lives of those for whom you share that space and for whom you're responsible. And we do not have autonomy for their personal lives. We do need to have a sort of social co-responsibility to move from a moral obligation to an ethical obligation to what was being said. We are interdependent beings. We cannot imagine that some people should be fully responsible for the care of dependents, and others just can sort of whistle away and ignore it. How do we do that? How can we lead to that ethical and social co-responsibility? Taking on shared responsibilities. And from the public administration and public policy, we can increase the availability of services, facilitate flexibility at work, revise timetables, and assume that you are not solely responsible for everything that happens around you. And furthermore, one thing that is linked to the use of time, at the end of the day, when we conquer new rights, that allows us to move further. Social co-responsibility of care are mutual reflection, are a mirror image of other matters of how we organize society. The use, when it comes to the use of time, guaranteeing the use of time implicitly involves redistributing work and tasks, because if there's no redistribution of tasks, there'll be no right to time. And for that, it is essential to recognize different rights, inter alia, the right to not care. So if I have the social responsibility of care and the moral right of care, means that I have to give up other rights, the right to work, the right to leisure, the right to train and foster my education. Well, I do not want to care, but not from a point of view of privilege, but because you're at the detriment of other rights. And in that sense, I should not feel necessarily guilty. Well, to supplement what you were saying, it's not discrepancy, but what you were saying, which I think is highly relevant, at that moment, and we look at societies, urban societies in the first world, there's a part of time for care, which is care for our elders, which is certainly not shared out equally. We live in societies which are increasingly aged, and there are many, basically women. The mental burden is huge, is vast, because to care for our elders at the latest phase of life is highly complicated. It's very different from caring for children. And then the question that when, and going back to the question that there should be public policies, which you were saying, yes, well, when there's certain individual, when we go to the family unit, individual unit, and the answer is, well, the solutions have to be individual. What that will do is to transfer the problem to other, mainly women, who are even worse situations, carers who are badly paid, with abusive contract terms or working conditions. It was always work for migrants and work in care, a bit like raw materials. right? Well, you were saying that the question of co-responsibility is not only amongst people, but in bringing on board this policies which are responsible for public policies. They'll have to be different than the ones we have now, but we need public services which are of a community nature and which cater for greater needs for time in care, for a drop in demographic pyramids. I think that is essential. The question of public policies is crucial. Yes, I fully agree. And the big challenge in care for elderly people, that is essential. We have Ulrich online who wishes to answer questions.
Thank you very much. It's a very interesting discussion which you have here. But I would like to come back to the point of time poverty, because this seems to be a very important point for the emergence of the right to time. And we had these interesting papers given by Emil and Asle, and the one of Lina from the European Parliament, where one conclusion was exactly that we need more statistical, clear, more statistical data on gendered use of time. And my question, however, is what are the measures, or what are the points of view which lead to the normative order of time poverty, that you can no longer support it, that a society has to do something against time poverty? This was in my talk the purchase basket, the shopping basket, which forms a sort of objective measurement when a time poverty can no longer be tolerated by society without a collision with human dignity. And so I ask those who deal with time poverty, what are the normative borders which you can formulate where time poverty is not only bad or something which people talk about negatively, but where it can no longer be tolerated? What is the borderline?
Bueno, gracias. No sé si alguno quiere.
Is there any other questions? Any other question from the audience? Okay, let me ask all the questions at once. The questions that I've been given, my own, and also Ulrich's question, but we don't have much time, so let's try and go straight to the point, because lunch is served outside, so do not leave, because you can have lunch outside once the session wraps up. Apart from Ulrich's remarks, a question for all of you would be, how would a society be with a right to time in health, inequality, and in sustainability, with specific examples, please? And then there's another question. When you say care work, which kind of care work do you refer to? And on that, I have a reflection to share with you. We mentioned the lack of statistical data and how difficult it is to measure even financial poverty because of the households and the family units, at least in the Catalan context. I'm not talking about individual poverty, let alone time poverty, but how difficult it is to have stats. I think that the last stat was published in 2011 about time uses, but we haven't had time use stats for a long time. So how can we say what happens, and how is care time used? Are we taking care of children or the elderly in an increasingly aging society? And then as to the question about the implementation of the right to time in our society, I have a question about best practices. Do you know of any best practice that you could share with us and that we could implement? Maybe you know of specific case studies. For example, in sleep studies, has it been implemented from a political standpoint for our society to sleep better? And I have other questions, such as the 32 work hour week. This is something that is being discussed in Spain. So how would that impact positively or not so positively? We'll see. Because it's also connected to time poverty and poverty at large. And then what about the future? We are saying that in the future, machines will replace us in the workplace. We'll have less to do. So what's your perspective on that one? And then specifically for Yayo, what about women and the nature of time? It is often said that the future will be ecofeminist or it will not be. But what's the link between women and nature when women have less time and apparently less time to enjoy nature? Nature is increasingly expensive. All beautiful natural spaces are increasingly private and privatized and not accessible for city dwellers. And city dwellers have less and less access to nature. And when they do access nature, well, it's because they can pay for it, they can afford it. Okay, open to you.
Yeah, that's
Bueno, lo primero que preguntabas de...
Well, the first question, clear examples, and how a society which respected the right to time related to health would be like. Well, working time, right? If you like, the working timetable, that is a key one. But when it comes to working timetables to protect the right to sleep, extensive working days, 32 hours. Well, there are 2 days of 32 hours. One is a weekly, and others are, if you like, a medical requirements when you have to be on duty, right? Overnight duties. Then you have 32 hours. There's legislation, thank goodness, on that to stop that. In the case of Argentina, the same when it comes to extensive works in certain occupations like coach or bus drivers or train drivers, which are allowed for up to 16 hours a day. And we're going to limit that to 12, which is no great shakes, but it's better than 16. And then one of labour legislation which has to do with the impact of sleep and health, the key one has to do with rotating shifts. In developed countries, a considerable percentage are working, say, 1 week you work during the day, or then you're off for a few days, and then you work at night, and so on. That will have a very negative bearing on your health, very well documented. WHO did look at the cancer, the risk of developing cancer if you were working these rotating shifts and day or night shifts. And it's seen as a disadvantage, as an advantage in the terms of workers, and because it gives them more free time. But companies see it as having available more flexibility with actions. In terms of minors in Chile, which is a vanguard in this legislation, ensuring that it actually complied with is a different matter. Much research has been carried out. And there are very recent, if you like, investigations, the circadian hospital, how health in a health center, it can respect circadian cycle in terms of sleep. Intensive therapy. And after intensive therapy, you have the light is on all time, and with pilot experiments being carried out, such as turning off the light at night, leads to greater healing. So the things, simple things have to be done. We have to share data above all.
Bueno, han salido muchísimas cosas.
Well, a lot has emerged. We don't have much time. I'll attempt to look at more of these interesting debates and attempt to touch upon it. Ulrich was saying, what is the like the threshold? Well, it's very difficult. I do think that there is an idea which is a total burden of work, which there should be an egalitarian, if you like, redistribution. And then we could look how to calculate that threshold. And that links up to this future society, looking at good practices, and how Diego was saying when we talk of cutback well, we live in a society where there is, if you like, a centrality which involves something almost unmovable, which is working times, and that doesn't really work from many perspectives. Well, we have to rethink this productive logic. Looking at the social organization of time in the last few centuries, in the Industrial Revolution, well, think what it's generating, what are the knock-on effects, what are the outcomes, and how we are going to ensure that we have livable lives. Well, there are many possible avenues. One is to cut back the working day. There's a discussion here if we can move forward to cut back that daily working time or working week length, say up to 35 hours a week or whatever. And from a gender perspective, I think that the line of action should lead to a synchronic reduction in the working day times and rather than the week one, because the logic of care of children and elderly dependents is worked out on a daily basis. I have a dependent person who needs, who is not autonomous, who needs somebody to needs help in eating, getting dressed. I can't say, okay, I'm going to only look after them on Tuesday, Saturday, on Thursday, because I have a 35-hour working day. If we wish to give visibility and social and economic visibility to other types of working, it is essential to work the amount of time we dedicate to remunerated work. That, for me, is the only feasible way of looking at things. The other possibility, if we talk of cutting back working week, and we're cutting back that to 4 days, well, then there will be one part of the population which will be able to avail themselves of that, and others who won't. Those who have a reduction in working week, in the days that they're not working, will wish to go to the restaurant, to the cinema, to the theatre, whatever. Others who are working won't be able to cut that back. If they do, it'll be in an asynchronous way. So if we start moving one bit of the jigsaw puzzle, we cannot only move one piece; we have to move the whole thing, the whole jigsaw, and it is essential to have an intersectional point of view in terms of view of distribution and timetable, distribution of times and timetable. And there's machines. Will machines replace work? Well, the work of care ain't going to be replaced by machines, I'm afraid. And if we look at a society which could decide that care can be taken up by robots is not a society which wish to be coherent with all the subjects that have been coming up here in terms of right to time and to be able to sleep and dream.
Una pincelada.
Oh, well, it was said, well, what do we refer to when we talk of care? Just to clarify that in the context we have mentioned, it refers to all those tasks which need time, which are essential to ensure that a body can be sustainable in time. We're talking of all the work that ensure that a young child can survive, especially in infancy, on a daily basis. We're talking of what a elderly person needs to carry out their daily life. We're talking of the time that certain persons need to carry out their daily lives. So we are talking of everything we as human beings need to carry on our lives, and above all, in a more intensive moment, certain point in our life cycle. That is, if you like, care work, which has to be carried out if we want people to live and have decent lives. It's not something which is going to be responsibility of only women. It has to be responsibility of all persons and of the decision-making institutions. That's what I refer when we talk of care work. Now, when it comes to subject which may affect time poverty, there are many things which have to do with that burden, which are not so much related to economic problems. Right now, we're facing a huge energy crisis, an energy crisis which does not stem only from the war in Ukraine. It has to do with coming up against the limits to fossil fuels, without which we cannot have the capitalist global economic model we have. And that moment, this energy crisis managed by market forces and the energy companies, they're people who cannot pay their bills, their energy bills. Anyone who is involved in those who are affected by, if you like, energy poverty and potential repossessions of their homes. There are many women who are aware that who have to go to the social service, spend long times in lines requesting help or subsidies, and when these social services cannot meet the needs of those persons, and many of these people will become activists in social movements, in movements against energy poverty or against repossessions, will have to add to that timetable. Will have to add the time to not just for care, but to the time to organize for carrying out basic needs, which in models which are not responsible for the needs of people. So when you are poor, the time dedicated to life multiplies. Those who use public transport, which is we all should use it, are basically domestic workers, women who will clean a house in a wealthy neighborhood, then have to go to a bank and are in buses and metros very early in the morning. These are the public transport we should all use, and we're going to have to be using them due to ecological crisis, but they are used basically by excluded people or impoverished people, and this mainly women, and this also leads to a big increase in use of time. You were talking about machines. Well, it's a big issue. Of course, what times of new privileges will work by machines exist in illustrated societies such as ours, with this idea of progress, which apparently the object of progress was to eliminate any kind of unpleasant effort and work. Now we find that to carry out a transition to renewables, to move towards electrical cars, to favor digital economy, and to mechanize the economy, we need a vast amount of minerals which are not easily available. And we look at the reserves and what we need, we realize that excessive mechanization without bearing in mind the need for sustainability and the need of all the population could have as unthought of knock-on effects new gaps between those who can obtain extra time due to mechanization and yet those who will find their time availability even less available. If we look at sort of the traffic chain in Silicon Valley, and then we look at the factory in Shenzhen in China, who are building chips with incredibly long working hours, and then miners, often miners in African countries, who are, if you like, hacking away the minerals for these massive, intensive manufacture in China. So I do think that reasoning with this umbilical cord which links the economy and society to the earth, if this is cut off, the umbilical cord is cut, what will happen is that we will deepen, if you like, human exploitation dynamic and therefore their loss of available time. Well, thanks all. Thanks to the three of you for having been here and also those who are online. My apologies, Emily, we are too late. There can be no more questions, I'm afraid. So we're going to have to bid farewell. Let me remind you that there is lunch now, and at 14:30 there will be a seminar where we'll talk about, if you like, timetabling change or time change. I don't know whether. Anyway, that's all. Thanks ever so much. Thanks to all of you.
Gracias, Fe.